friends, and welcome to another video. One that is a life lesson for me about looking at the weather before I schedule my filming days. It is 96 degrees outside, it is 81 in here. Things are great. Everything is great. We are warm and we're rolling with it. Today we're going to talk about a disabled spy in the Philippines during the Second World War, and then all of the things she did after that made her even more cool than she already was. Now, interestingly, in researching this, I discovered that she is not the only famous disabled spy from World War II. I found another one who was in France and she had a prosthetic leg. So I might cover that another time. If you're interested, let me know. I'll track more information down about that. I didn't realize this was a particular niche of historical storytelling, but like I kind of love that it is, and I'm gonna keep an eye out to see if I find anything else beyond that. My primary source for this video is a book that's titled The Leper Spy of World War II by Ben Montgomery. And every time I do a video that's primarily centered around one book with like adjacent disability commentary, I always feel like nervous that I'm taking away from the author to some extent, because I know that by watching my video you're less likely to read the book, and that feels kind of unfair. I say that well knowing that summarizing books and or movies with no added commentary is a whole subgenre on YouTube, and it's fine, and I like watching that kind of content. I just personally feel a little bad about it, but also in all honesty I cannot recommend this book anyway, so I guess it doesn't really matter. For review purposes of said book, I found it to be incredibly weirdly structured in a way that made it near impossible to concretely follow what was going on until like the halfway point. I had to track down the ebook to follow along with the audiobook in order to properly note take and try to follow the story, and even then I had to keep pausing to look things up because it was still super unclear what was happening or like what timeline we were on or what was just, it was a really baffling book to read. And then also the first half, which takes place during the war, was like 70% war history and 30% the story of the spy, which like isn't what you expect from the book when you go into it given its title. Of course you need the war history to understand what was important about the spying. We're going to talk about that today, but it talked so little about the spying that I learned more about what she did in the second half of the book via other historical accounts post-war honoring her work as a spy than I did from the author himself during the actual spy historical section. It also like really aggressively implied that Filipinos loved being colonized by the Americans and looked up to them as like inspirational father figures, which was not my favorite, and like bordering on outright propaganda, which then like led me to spend a lot of time fact checking every other thing mentioned in this book because that automatically made me not trust the source at all. It did otherwise turn out to be very well researched beyond the war propaganda. Like everything else checked out. That lens was just really dubious to say the least, and made the war history make less sense because the US completely failed the Philippines during World War II, and he was trying to be like, the US is great! So him trying to balance those two narratives on top of each other just didn't work, and then it didn't make any sense. So the plan is to tell you the story of that story, except without the pro-military lens and in a cohesive order that you can hopefully actually follow, also with a touch of disability history and commentary mixed in. It's gonna be a great time, and maybe don't read this book. Now, the first thing we need to do is talk about the Philippines, because I'm sure for many of you, your history class taught you about like Ferdinand Magellan and Dewey was an admiral on Manila Bay, and oh yeah, World War II had a Pacific theater, but like it's not all that important, and then you never heard about this country again. I will say I spent a lot of lockdown reading every textbook that I found in my house cover to cover. Can assure you the Philippines does actually appear in the intended curriculum a lot more than that, but at least in my experience the desire for Eurocentric history and for any discussion of World War II to be exclusive to Germany, and then like, yeah, Pearl Harbor also happened and there was an atomic bomb, but anyway, which led to all of those chapters being conveniently skipped over, but they are in your textbooks if you're ever bored and you want to go back. That's not a task everybody enjoys. I enjoyed it. Anyway, obviously the history of a country's colonization is not its primary history, and there is so much other fascinating Filipino history we just cannot get into right now, but for the sake of both brevity and the crucial context leading up to their part in the Second World War, that's what we're going to focus on today. I did find a YouTube historian named Kirby Aurelio, apologies if I pronounced that wrong. He focuses on Filipino history specifically, so if you do need an interesting rabbit hole after this and want to add more of that information to your understanding of world history, definitely go check out his channel. I highly recommend that you do. Anyway, so the Philippines are an archipelagic nation, which means it's a chain of islands rather than one solid landmass. Hawaii is also an archipelago, for example. It's made up of 137 islands. The Philippines has about 7,641. I don't know how you can count that many islands and not like forget some. Do they all have names? I logistically have a lot of questions. Anyway, people lived there for a very, very long time, and they had trade with other Asian countries starting in the late hundreds AD. There's a lot of really fascinating like ancient human history and like early hominid history related to the Philippines. And then in 1521, it was discovered, in air quotes, by Ferdinand Magellan and claimed it for Spain. Notably, He would be killed like 42 days into living there, but despite that, colonization of the islands would still begin in 1565. The Philippines would remain a Spanish colony until the early 1760s, when it was like very briefly British due to the 7 Years' War, and then it was Spanish again. In the 1800s, they opened up their ports to world trade, which changed a lot of cultural things on the islands, as often happens when getting more connection to other places around the world, and that began to really stoke this like revolutionary sentiment for the Filipinos, ultimately leading to the 1896 revolution, after which they declared independence from Spain in June of 1898 and established a new independent government. Now, while that was happening, Spain was in the middle of the Spanish-American War, and at the end of that war, 6 months after Filipino independence had been declared, they would cede some of their colonies to the United States. That included Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And that obviously did not go over well with the locals, who were like, hi, we're independent. What is going on here? And so they fought the US as hard as they possibly could from 1899 to 1902, and that was a war that killed anywhere from 250,000 to 1 million civilians, primarily due to famine and disease. Notably, the United States would also make use of concentration camps during this time and create a bunch of military bases around the archipelago. At the end of the war in 1902, an American civilian government was established. So if you too are wondering where the author of today's book got the Filipinos loved the Americans point of view from in an era that was maybe 2.5 to 3 decades after the situation, I also am confused logistically about that. Filipino national identity and desire for independence continued to grow after this war, and in 1934 the United States created a 10-year transition plan to full independence that gradually passed over the government piece by piece to try to keep it stable rather than just like leaving them to just figure it out. But this did mean that the United States was planning and intending to withdraw their troops by 1944, and thus hadn't really put much funding or training into the combined Filipino-American military, diverting all of their funding and general aid directly toward fighting the war effort in the European theater against Hitler, which meant that they were very unprepared when the Japanese invaded about 9 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Like, volunteer army, mostly of very young people who had never been away from home with weaponry from the First World War level unprepared, versus what the Japanese had going on at the time as a military power. So when the Japanese invaded, the troops immediately withdrew to Bataan to see if they could try to hold off there as a combined army, leaving Manila to surrender themselves, but the Japanese bombed it a lot anyway, and then within a month Manila had a new Japanese regime that was completely in charge. That same month, the Filipino-American army would be defeated in the Battle of Bataan, as well as the Battle of Corregidor 3 months later, both of which involved a lot of deaths and even more war crimes. The US would occasionally promise to send aid and help out and be like, yeah, you're doing great, thanks for fighting for us, but would never actually do anything to help, as the soldiers were continuing to waste away. Many of them died of malaria, beriberi, and dysentery, as well as starvation due to how much they were having to cut down their rations. The archipelago would be liberated by Allied forces beginning October 1944, taking back control of Manila in March of 1945, and the country finally became independent on July 4th, 1946. Now, amidst all of this, aligned with the general vibe of resistance to colonization that I hope has been shining through here, hundreds of thousands of people became involved in large-scale guerrilla activity against the Japanese. Their landmass made it kind of easy to do that. There's a lot of mountains you can go hide in, so there was a lot of hiding in mountains and that kind of stuff. Also, interestingly, one of the only times the Japanese allowed Filipinos to like hang out and like be in groups together was under church settings. It was a very religious country. It probably still is a very religious country, I would assume. Didn't Google that. But they would start to be like, oh, we've organized a new church choir and we have to have choir practice every week, so that's what we're doing. And then they would actually be doing guerrilla stuff constantly. That was a thing that was really common. Church services were also commonly used as covers for guerrilla interference and resistance activity, which I just think is really, really smart and really cool. One of the people involved in this resistance activity was Joey Guerrero. Joey was born as Josefina Valuya on the 5th of August 1917 in Lucban, which is outside of Manila, and she grew up very religious, and specifically while recovering from tuberculosis as a child after being orphaned, used to imagine that she was Joan of Arc. During this time, after her parents' passing, she wanted to go live in a convent, but they were unable to take care of her there because of her tuberculosis, so she was taken in by her grandparents on their coconut plantation, and once she had recovered from her TB, she was sent to live with an uncle in Manila so she could enroll in a good school. She was sent to one that was primarily populated by the children of wealthy families, and when her money ran low, she would work to pay her own way. Joey was on every athletic team. She was the president of the student council and had a particular interest for anything related to the arts, be that music, poetry, or visual arts, but had a particular love for classical music. When she was 16, on April 21st, 1934, she married a 26-year-old medical student by the name of Renee Maria Guerrero. 2 years later, she would give birth to a baby girl named Cynthia. A few years later, she would begin to develop splitting headaches, followed by chronic fatigue, then struggled significantly with appetite and was losing a lot of weight, and then saw a small pink splotch appear on her cheek, at which point she finally decided to tell her husband, something might be wrong and I don't like it, and he brought her to a specialist, and in 1941 she was diagnosed with leprosy, now more known as Hansen's disease. We'll be using those two words interchangeably throughout this video. Now, because she was so devout and religious, and the Bible has a lot of not so nice things to say about lepers, she initially processed this through her faith, and this is also the cultural view of the Philippines at the same time, as something shameful and indicative of divine punishment for some great sin. At this time in Manila, people with leprosy were often sent to leprosariums, which is the nicer word for leper colonies, where they were basically warehoused in conditions so awful you can't even really call it a camp. It was just kind of like a bunch of people shoved somewhere and they need to figure it out, and there was no like medical care or anything like that. Now, interestingly, by this point in history, it was scientifically known that this wasn't really necessary, as roughly 95% of the population is naturally immune to the bacterium that causes Hansen's disease, and it takes extensive interaction with somebody who is infected to get the infection yourself, if you're even susceptible to it, which again, many people are not. But complete quarantine and straight up casting out from society was still standard practice pretty much globally anyway. Now, leprosy is a bacterial infection, much like tuberculosis, that primarily impacts the skin and the nervous system, starting with small skin lesions and slowly turning into things like general numbness and muscle weakness and paralysis, because your nervous system is basically just being eaten away, kind of. Over time, that numbness and weakness can cause people suffering with the disease to repeatedly injure extremities without noticing, which can lead to the loss of said extremities. Notably, you cannot die of leprosy specifically, only from complications of it, like the other things it does to your body, which can cause infections and starvation, and some extremities you might lose are kind of important, stuff like that. Meaning that once diagnosed, you spend a very, very long time struggling with symptoms. It's a pretty gnarly disease. It also has a very slow replication rate, so you can be infected with it for many, many years before noticing any symptoms, also much like tuberculosis, and along with TB, it is one of the oldest contagions known to mankind. So you'll see a lot of comparisons between them in the historical record. Because of the nature of its symptoms, there are probably many cases in ancient history of people with things like psoriasis and also syphilis and other conditions that lead to skin lesions and general disfigurement being mistaken for leprosy. That historical record is, of course, kind of fuzzy on that front. If you've never tried to do a concrete differential diagnosis solely based on a historical record written by a dude who firmly believes the uterus walks around the human body, you are a lucky person. It's rough out there and it's hard to parse through things, but there are theories that that was a common thing that happened, which also awful. Imagine having one skin condition that is like bad in one direction and then being sent to a leper colony where you could develop that skin condition, and then everything's just, that doesn't sound like a good time. Anyway, interestingly, prior to the bubonic plague, people with leprosy were generally treated more as people needing pity and people needing to be saved. It was still viewed as divine punishment, as most disabilities were at the time. This is not any way unique to leprosy. I'll link my Shakespeare era analysis of disability above for you on whichever side that's supposed to be. It talks about that a bit if you want to know more about early history disability and how it functioned, and also the creation of the word disabled in the English language. But they were definitely still cast out from society. It just wasn't like a, hey, we're gonna drop you on a deserted island like all the other people like you so we don't catch it kind of vibe that we see in later periods. At this time, it was more like just outside of town. So people could go visit them to do their charity work, and people with leprosy, they were required to wear bells to inform people that they were ill and contagious, would often come into town to beg in the streets. There's lots of extant images of this being the case. After the bubonic plague appeared and started wiping out a massive portion of the population, everybody became terrified of anybody sick, in literally any way, and I'm sure that having a disease that caused visible skin lesions made them particular targets, and so it turned into a complete shunning and casting out from society. Notably in Europe, there was a significant drop in leprosy cases during the medieval period, which is often attributed to an increase in sanitation in this era. I also wouldn't be surprised if, because an immunosuppressed person is more likely to develop leprosy, they'd also be more likely to develop, say, the plague and die of that before their leprosy became apparent. Medicine was always kind of confused about leprosy and what caused it and where it came from, because it seemed to appear sort of at random. Again, not unlike the history of tuberculosis, which we now know is because the replication rate is so slow and so super long, and most people are immune to it, which adds to this feeling of it popping up out of nowhere because somebody might have been sick for 10 years before you actually notice that they're sick. Theorists Priests and scientists and doctors battled it out, arguing whether it was something contagious or whether it was hereditary. In the historical record, I saw the hereditary piece of it written about and discussed more as being the case, but then of course the main course of action for a leper was to get them as far away from all people as humanly possible, so I do feel like contagion was also very much a factor there. They just acted on one and spoke about another, if that makes any sense. But all of this was put to rest in 1873 when a Norwegian scientist by the name of G.H. Armauer Hansen discovered leprosy's causative agent, Mycobacterium leprae. This is the first bacterium to be identified as causing disease in humans, which is pretty cool. But the first antibiotic for leprosy would not appear until 1940. For context for that, if you don't know, penicillin, which is the first antibiotic, was discovered in 1928 at St. Mary's Hospital in London, actually, which is a block down the street from Paddington Station. There's a little plaque of like, penicillin was discovered here. I took a picture of it. I'll put it on the screen. I thought it was really cool. But that discovery led to a huge boom in the creation of medications and treatments for all kinds of things because antibiotics are helpful. So having them meant that we could create more kinds of them. The first antibiotic for leprosy was called Promone. It was a sulfone drug, but you had to keep taking it for many, many, many years, which led to resistant strains growing in the 60s. There was a treatment that appeared in the mid to late 1910s that was kind of discovered by a woman, which is also really cool. And some patients did get better, but the rates of efficacy always raised a lot of questions. Whereas this one in comparison was well studied. It just took a really long time, if not like for the rest of the person's life. In the 60s and 70s, we saw the creation of other drugs in response to the original drug-resistant strains, which have now become a specific multi-drug therapy that is still utilized today. These were primarily developed at the Carville Leprosarium, the United States' only hospital and sort of tiny city. They had like shops and a school and stuff like that, located in Louisiana specifically for patients with Hansen's disease. And that name for it would start to become more popular over leprosy in common parlance thanks to a patient at Carville named Stanley Stein, who began a newsletter there called The Star, where he wrote and educated about leprosy, and then he would send letters to every single newspaper, broadcast source, whatever, that ever used leper or leper colony as a derogatory to explain to them why they were wrong in contributing to stigma and request to use alternative language in the future. He did this for, I think, decades, so thank you, Stanley, specifically for his work on this. He's also probably the reason that leprosy and leper masks are no longer really used in mass in the way that they used to be used very commonly, apparently. I didn't grow up Catholic, so I don't know all that much about that, but we can thank Stanley for all of his work in that particular regard. But back to Joey for a hot second, because we still need to talk about her being a spy. Now, after she was diagnosed in 1941, because there was some treatment available at the time and her husband was fairly well-to-do, he found her a doctor who could treat her privately at home, meaning she could still keep her social standing and kind of keep it hidden that she had leprosy. He and her daughter would go to live with Renee's mother, and she would kind of lose a relationship with that daughter. She never really was able to connect with her in the future. Joey would then live by herself in the original house with 2 servant girls who would help to take care of her. Now, after the Japanese invaded, it became virtually impossible for her to access any medication due to the city being in shambles. It did still exist, but mostly on the black market for exorbitant prices that she could not afford, meaning that her symptoms continued to worsen because she no longer had access to treatment. Realizing she was probably going to die of this disease, she decided to pull a Joan of Arc and use her life for good. So she joined the guerrilla resistance and said, "Hey, how can I be useful? I really just want to be useful for what time I have remaining." Her very first job was to take note of the truck movement outside of her house, as she lived near a building that had been converted into a Japanese garrison, and report the schedules and what kinds of things that she saw. Her secret name was Billy Ferrer. At one point, she was invited to a party on a local university campus where she decided to ask a lot of questions, and in doing so discovered a set of secret tunnels, which she mapped out when she got home and sent along. She was then asked to be a courier to carry messages from place to place, and she would hide messages inside her hair, inside hollowed out fruit in a basket pretending to be a street vendor, in between 2 pairs of socks, so if she were strip searched, she could take them both off as one sock. But because of her condition and her visible, like, open sores on her face and the rest of her body that she developed more of over the course of the war, the checkpoint guards were less and less inclined to search her or, like, touch her at all, believing that she was unclean and also not a significant threat, which made her practically immune to the strip search that was so common with others going through checkpoints, which made her really good at passing messages. She was sometimes called the Lady in Black, as she would often travel wearing a black veil that hid her sores from others, and also at one point, some explosives were hidden in her home for a while, and she was just cool with that. But her biggest and most dangerous spy mission of all was that she was handed a map of minefields and told to bring it to American headquarters 35 miles away on foot, while there was active fighting going on along that path. This map would protect the Americans as they made their way in to liberate Manila from the Japanese, but only if she got it to them. She taped it between her shoulder blades and she walked to her destination, carefully going around active combat zones. And when she got there after walking 35 miles, she discovered the troops had moved on. So she had to backtrack a couple miles to find the person that she was meant to hand it to, who was in complete shock that they sent a woman at all to do that particular job, but she did succeed. I also want to mention, since we talked more specifically about general leprosy symptoms and not her specific leprosy symptoms, at this time she was having severe back pain, chronic migraines, her joints were just really inflamed, and she had tons of open sores all over her body, and she was obviously exhausted. So imagine experiencing all of that and still doing this. And I'm not saying that in like a, wow, disabled people are so inspirational kind of way, but in just like, wow, when I feel like that, I lay on the floor for 6 hours, and I'm just really admiring the bravery and the commitment to service that she had at this point in her life. During liberation, she would work as much as she could to take care of the injured and the dying until she was too unwell to go on and went to the Jesuits to ask for help, as her home had been destroyed in the Battle of Manila. She was taken in by them, and they kept trying to take care of her, but she kept giving away all the clothes and all of the food they were giving her to other people that she thought needed help more than she did, which led to a priest having to formally forbid her from doing that. And while she was there, somebody reported that they had a leper under their roof, and so she was taken and placed, after the priest tried really hard to get her placed somewhere else, but they didn't succeed long term, at one of the nation's completely neglected leprosariums. She tried to make the best of things while she was there, working as a school teacher and a chaplain and figuring out how to build rudimentary coffins to bury their dead, because they weren't even given that. And at some point she reached out to Maria Dachauer, who was a woman doing charity work around tuberculosis in the United States, to ask her for help to make this place a little bit less horrible for the residents, because they were like starving, they had no medication, they had no beds, the roofs were all leaking, like it was just not a great time. And Marie passed this letter on to Father Abbot Paul, who was the priest at Carville, and he sent that along to Anne Page, a patient who was also Carville's main teacher and librarian and worked at the Star. Anne decided to print this letter in the Star and organize a drive to collect linens and games and books to send over to their Filipino comrades. Meanwhile, in May of 1946, a woman by the name of Gertrude Hornbostel, who had formerly been interned at a Japanese prison camp during the war and was the wife of Major Hans Hornbostel, was diagnosed with Hansen's disease and went to Carville to get treatment. And her husband insisted on being with her there. He was like, I was away from you for the whole war and will never be separated from you again. I cannot do this. So he bought a cottage that was nearby to the hospital because he wasn't allowed to live with her at the hospital, and visited with her from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. every single day. They did this whole media campaign to try to talk about how wrong it was to functionally put these people in jail just for being ill, and how it wasn't right that he wasn't able to stay with her full time because he probably wasn't going to get the disease because of what science says about the unlikeliness of contagion. And Gertrude then began her own column in the Star railing against all of the ethics of being treated like criminals. All of which made many people across America not only learn that leprosy still existed, because many people didn't know that it was like a biblical disease. Many people still think that, but also that it was actively affecting people. So subscriptions to the Star grew and more attention was on leprosy. By this point in history, with the newer forms of medication, it took between 18 months and 5 years to suppress the disease, but patients were being discharged as leprosy-free, which led to the National Advisory Council on Leprosy trying to create new and less restrictive recommendations based on the new science, which would be reported about in the Star that was now read all over the country. Meanwhile, Joey's story about the atrocious conditions of her leprosarium finally breaks in Manila 18 months after her letter reached the United States in January of 1947, leading to a lot of work to try to clean up these facilities and make things nicer, as the state of the hospital, which we'll put air quotes around, was just embarrassing Manila on a very international stage now that this story had broken. Also during this time, Joey would become close friends with a Dr. Leo Aloser, who you may remember as Frida Kahlo's close friend and doctor from one of last month's videos. Who knew there was a Disability History cinematic universe? But I read this name and I screamed. I was so excited. He had been working under the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration in rural China, and he went to see what was going on at the Tala Leprosarium because he was interested in communicable diseases like tuberculosis and leprosy, where he would then become close to Joey. They bonded over their love of music because he was a violist, turns out, and they also loved art and literature, and he would explain a lot of the science of the various Carville medication breakthroughs to her so that she could understand what was going on in leprosy research. At some point, she wrote to him apologizing that she was asking for help for herself because she never wanted to do that, but she was hoping to get to America to be able to get treated at Carville, and learned that people with leprosy could not get a passport without a formal recommendation from the Surgeon General, and she needed help doing so. This request got passed around and eventually ended up in the hands of the Surgeon General, but he said decided it was probably best if she just got transferred in country to see a doctor who was trained at Carville in administering the medication for Hansen's disease. So she was transferred to a Dr. Rodriguez in Manila, but he had no access to the medication because it was still too expensive there. So then she just kept trying to get to the United States because she was like, I'm going to die of this before I can get treated, but there is treatment and I want it. On May 29th, 1948, she was awarded a Medal of Freedom by President Truman for her work as a spy to help the Americans during the war, along with the Cardinal Spellman Medal for her Christian work in supporting her fellow patients. After which, people worked even harder to try to get her case paid attention to so that she could get sent to the United States, which did end up being successful. She was given a special visa so she could go to Carville for treatment and arrived in July of 1948 at age 30. It was a massive news sensation, and in July of 1948, she got an article published specifically about her in Time magazine. And this, of course, was not that long after the popularity of the Hornbostel's case, so eyes were very much on Carville and on Hansen's disease. Now, when Joey arrived, she got involved in everything almost immediately. Nobody is surprised by that. She joined the team of the Star. She worked really hard on earning her high school diploma, and she later received a scholarship to do home courses at a fashion college, making all kinds of garments for herself and her fellow residents. She also read to those who were unable to. She helped pen letters for those who were unable to, in addition to trying to respond to every single piece of correspondence she ever received. And occasionally, if she possessed free time, she liked playing badminton. At age 36, she graduated from school as valedictorian of her class, and during the ceremony, a petition was passed around the audience as her visa had expired and the government was trying to deport her, despite her not having finished her course of treatment. Many different congresspeople pitched bills to try to give her special permission to stay in the country, but it was continuously stalled, and it would take about a decade after this point for her to finally receive her citizenship. In 1957, she married a fellow patient named Alec Lau, potentially as a green card marriage, given how quickly her lawyer friends helped her process a divorce from Renee, in an attempt to get her permanent status. It probably helped a little bit in the short term, but not in the long term, and she would divorce him at some point. But after nearly a decade at Carville, she was finally declared disease-free and moved to California and found a job as a secretary, which she really enjoyed, but the threat of deportation continued to loom. At one point, she went on television to try to further advocate for her cause, and finally in 1964, she won. Somewhere around this time, she would change her last name to Lomax, wanting to separate herself from all of the notoriety and just like live a quiet life in America. She went back to school and became a Spanish teacher, doing all kinds of service all around the world, much of it in the Peace Corps, and then settled in Washington, D.C. as an usher at the Kennedy Center for 17 years, just content to be close to the classical music she so adored, and of course, being close to a church down the street, which she went to mass at every day, as she always had. She gave away everything she could, as much as she could, even if she had nothing to give away, and she died on June 18th, 1996, at which point her friends going through her belongings found quite the mystery, trying to figure out who she actually was. She's buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Now, Hansen's disease still very much exists today, though Carville has now turned into a museum after closing its doors in 2005. Last year, we saw 174 new cases reported in the United States, but of course, it is completely treatable, so that means completely different things now than it used to. Its largest numbers today are from India, Brazil, and Indonesia, though there are 23 primary countries where it is mostly diagnosed around the world. Due to stigma and shame, it's not universally treated. People often hide after being diagnosed, not realizing there's medication for them, and of course, there also isn't always the money and the resources for medication, but the future of people diagnosed with Hansen's disease looks a lot brighter than it did in Joey's time. Much of it thanks to her, because she was one of the key players in this work around education and stigma reduction in the 40s and the 50s. Now, my original idea to end this video was to honor Joey's commitment to service by suggesting a specific leprosy organization to donate to that I would also be making a donation to as well, but all of the main ones are incredibly religious and most of them have mission in their title, and I couldn't, I tried really hard to parse through all of their resources on every single one of them to figure out if proselytizing, colonizing style work was happening along with expansion to access to medical care, and I couldn't figure it out, and I don't want to recommend any organization to you that I cannot 100% put my heart and soul behind, so we've cut that idea. In its place, however, one organization doing work also in the vein of saving people from preventable deaths that I can stand 10 toes down behind is a Rhode Island-based organization called Adicia that creates specialized food packets to save the lives of children suffering from malnutrition all over the world. So I'm going to link them at the top of the description if you want to donate in Joey's honor there instead. I will be doing so. I donate to them often. Absolutely no pressure. I know that money is tight for everybody right now. You're also welcome to just do an act of service in your community. That is just as impactful. It just didn't feel like right to end this story with a simple like, wasn't she cool? Have a nice day. Because like based on everything that I read about this person, I don't think she would appreciate being in the spotlight on some sort of pedestal without some sort of cause connected to it. Though just by nature of her being a disabled Filipina spy, her story already holds a huge cause and a lot of power just by itself and by existing. But anyway, I'm gonna leave this one here. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and so is helping your community however and whenever you can. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.